from the start to sort of the end. So yeah, if anyone's got any questions at the end, I'm more than happy to try and do my best to answer them. Okay. So yeah, as the girls mentioned, I work at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute as a research officer.
We've just had a little technical glitch on.
Alison, can you hear Kristina?
Yeah, it's frozen for us too.
No, no, I couldn't hear her.
No, we can't hear either. She must be having problems with
I'll do
her.
it again.
No, that's definitely frozen.
Okay.
I think it'll probably kick in a minute.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. Is that Kristina? Yep.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Sorry, you were just...
Yeah, you had a little freezing moment.
Yeah, it dropped out.
Yes.
Sorry.
You're back. All good.
I just, can you see my slides?
We can see the slides and we can hear you.
I think that what's happened is I'm now hooked up twice. Yeah.
Yes, you are. I can see you twice. You're offline and you're online.
Yeah. Sorry about this.
No, that's all right. It's a learning process.
It's probably going to take me a couple minutes to fix this.
No, that's okay. That's fine.
We can still hear you, Kristina, and we can see your slides.
Okay, they're attached to my other computer, so I'm just trying to... Here we go,
right.
actually.
No drama. We can wait a minute. You just do what you need to do and all good.
Can you see my slides?
All good. And we can see the slides, yes.
Are you seeing the second slide?
Not yet.
There
we are.
There we got it.
You're in action. Thank you. We're good to go.
Okay, I think there's just a bit of a lag, so it was confusing me. All right, cool. Never mind. Okay, so yeah, speaking broadly about the research process, there's a couple of things that the researcher is responsible for doing. So first of all, the first step in research broadly is for the researchers to sit down and have a think about the latest research on the given topic that they're studying, and to have a really good look into research available that's already been
No, we're losing you again, Kristina. No, we're losing you again. We can't hear you. Can you hear us?
Sounds like a very Spanish guitar.
It does, Alison. Kristina, we've lost you again. Maybe try. Oh, I think it's not your night for internet connections. No, we still can't hear you.
Sure. So I'm Aaron Schindeler. I'm a researcher at the Children's Hospital at Westmead in Sydney. I've been involved in NF1 research for the last 16 years or so, which I guess is a little while.
Quite
yeah. So I just thought I'd talk about one sort of story today, which is something that we've been working on over the last few years. But I mean, I think we've done a lot, and I've been involved with a lot of different projects in the NF1 space. This one's probably one of the ones I'm more proud of. But we did some work in the early 2000s that really changed the way that people look at treating tibial pseudoarthrosis and some of the bone problems associated with NF1. So we were involved in creating the first local knockout mouse model of NF1 in the tibia, and developed some drug interventions that are now clinically used in by orthopedic surgeons in our hospital and other hospitals for treatment. So, I mean, I think we one of the goals of all of our research is that of clinical translation, of trying to find problems that are of concern to the NF community, and then trying to find ways to improve quality of life and clinical outcomes. So I just thought I'd talk today about one of the more recent projects that we've been working on, and this sort of grew out of work that's been sort of initiated by several groups internationally. The first I heard about the muscle involvement in NF1 was at a meeting where Kathy North introduced me to a Brazilian researcher who had a son with NF1 who he was convinced was weaker than other children, and he did a small clinical study and showed reduced strength. And Kathy thought it was fascinating and thought that that this was something that I'd be interested in, because I also have a muscle research background. And this is some work that was done on the screen from the Children's Hospital Westmead, where we looked at muscle strength from a whole bunch of different muscle movements in a large cohort of children with NF and matched controls. And we found a significant, so 20 to 40% reduction in strength. And it's sort of compatible with some work from Belinda Barton from back into the early to mid 2000s, showing that individuals with NF1 or adolescents, children, have a low physical self-concept. And through various meetings and camps and whatnot, quite a few people have expressed to me that concern, not just about strength, but the idea about fatigue and tiredness as well. So that's how we sort of started this project. And the way that you know, with my background as a scientist with an interest in clinical outcomes, we turned to the science and we created a mouse model. And there's a lot of sort of the breakthroughs, I think, in the NF1 field have initiated from preclinical models, although it is something that we these days struggle to get funded, is any sort of preclinical research. So what we did is we created a mouse where we knocked out the NF1 gene, but we knocked it out specifically in muscle. And what we found is that it resulted not in any changes to the structure of the muscle itself, but rather, you'll see sort of panel CD, these little blobs, and those blobs we speculated to be fat, and that wasn't there in our non-knockout mice. And then when we went through and did some staining, you'll see little red dots in there. That's all fat in the muscle tissue of knockout mice that we didn't see in controls. And then we got some biopsies from children with NF, and we found similarly this pattern, a characteristic pattern of intramyocellular fat. So that means fat within the muscle. So that was really eye-opening for us to sit there and say, well, you know, this is something that we see in the mouse, something that we see in children. Maybe this is related to the muscle weakness. And looking at the mechanisms, and I don't want to dwell too much on pathways and all that sort of stuff, you know, at 8 o'clock at night. But there is some pretty well characterized biology about pathways that are involved in NF1, and some of you may have heard about MEK inhibitors and being used as a therapy for certain cancers. So we were interested in trying to see whether that could reverse the muscle lipid phenotype. And we did some experiments, and we found indeed, if you hit that pathway, you can knock it out. If you give it during the development of a mouse during embryogenesis, and you know, when they're little pups, it knocks it out. Unfortunately, what we did find as a follow-up study was that if you give it to mature mice where they already have that sort of pattern that you see in the middle with the red dots, it doesn't go away. So for us, this wasn't a therapy. So then we went back to square one, and I think that's one of the things that Kristina may touch on, is that sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong, and that's what research is about, is trying to then pursue new ideas. So what we did, and this is a lovely complicated pattern here, is we took the fat from the muscle, or extracted the muscle fat, and analyzed it with a group in Melbourne, which takes all of the fats and individually analyzes them. So we can take like 15,000 different fat molecules that you would find normally in a complex sample and divide them up. You get this sort of color map pattern. But the big thing that we found was that certain fats were elevated significantly in our knockout mice, and these sort of CEs, or stands for cholesterol esters, triglycerides. But there are all these things with linked to these C20, C18 fats, which are what are called long chain fats. So some of you might have heard of short chain fats, long chain fats. Certain foods have short chain fats, certain fats have long chain fats, and they end up building up in your body. And it turns out that in the case of the NF1 mice, they were getting a buildup of all of these long chain fats. So we went away, and I think as Kristina was saying in the beginning, is we did some thinking, did some reading, and it turns out there's a whole class of diseases where that feature lipid buildup in the muscle that are involved with long chain fat processing. So things like primary carnitine deficiency and neutral lipid storage disease and multiple acetyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiency. And the way that they are treated clinically is by diet and dietary supplements to supply some of these missing nutraceuticals, or missing cofactors. So we went and sort of looked at, and this is sort of an example of the pathway of how fats get trafficked and the long chain fats get broken down. So we followed this up with another mouse study, this time using a different mouse model where the mice are just missing NF1 in their limbs, and they build up all this muscle fat. And you can see, hopefully, on a standard diet, all that muscle fat there. And when we put them on a modified diet with reduced long chain fats and a supplement, a nutritional supplement, which is involved with fat trafficking, we ended up reducing that down to almost nothing. And that was something that we published about a year and a half ago, and we got very excited about that. So since then, we've had some feedback from various individuals in the community who've been aware of our research and sort of found our papers and tried that out on their children. Yeah. And anecdotally, we've had some positive feedback about that. Enough for us to continue doing the research and do some tests on fatigue, which you can see here, showing that this dietary intervention reduces fatigue, but also enough for us to prompt a clinical trial, which we now have underway. So that has been commenced this year. We're recruiting children between 8 and 12 years old with a confirmed diagnosis of NF1 and with a medical history of muscle weakness and fatigue, who obviously are not already on the nutraceutical supplements that we're giving for the study. So we've recruited people to this, and they are now in the process of taking supplements, and we have you can see here a process by which there's a baseline measurements done. They come back at 6 weeks and then at 12 weeks, and we have a combination of functional measures, patient-reported measures, and things like serum biochemistry and liver and kidney tests for some sort of mechanistic data of how these things are working. And individuals in the study are given the option to continue following on with the treatment if they feel like they're having positive outcomes.
Great.
So I guess I'm going to end it sort of there. I tried to keep this quite short.
No, great.
But I mean, I think that returning to the issue of muscle weakness, it is I don't want to overstate the muscle weakness being something that everyone with NF1 has. It certainly exists on a spectrum, and it impacts on different individuals differently. But certainly we've haven't had a major problem finding people with concerns about muscle strength that have led us to continue to recruit and pursue this. And it turns out that the intervention that we're using, it's low cost, it's highly accessible. That we're talking about things that anyone can buy over the counter at a pharmacy without a prescription, with very few complications or side effects. But at the same time, we're trying to sort of keep this from being just broadly adopted without strong scientific evidence. So once these things get out as this definitely works, everyone's on it, and it makes actual proper research to see how effective it is very challenging. I did put like a little thing there. I think there may be 1 or 2 slots still left in the trial.
I was going to ask if you're still recruiting. Yeah.
We are still recruiting. It is that 8 and 12. We had the 8 to 12 years. People often ask, can people outside that age group be in the trial? The answer, unfortunately, is no. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that people can't inquire to their medical professionals about it, and also keep their eye out, because I mean the idea is once this trial is finished and we analyze the data, if it is positive, not only will we publish this, it is likely that more trials will begin on a more wide scale. So this is all because the nutraceuticals are fairly safe and accessible and low cost. It's the sort of trials that can happen quite readily, as opposed to some of the more expensive drug trials where the drugs can be quite expensive. Yeah. This is not costing a large amount, I think, for relatively speaking. So I just want to thank our funding sources, because you have to thank people. Thank the funding sources. And a lot of the initial work for this particular project, interestingly, was funded by the U.S. Department of Defense. I have an American accent. I am half American, but at the same time an Australian citizen and been here for most of my life. But the U.S. Department of Defense has supported a lot of NF1 research, including this. And obviously, thank you all of the people who've been involved with this, particularly Matt Summers and Emily Vasilevsky have been involved with it in the last few years a lot, although Kate Sullivan did a lot of early work on that sort of electron microscopy and initial characterization of the first mouse. So, yeah.
Fabulous, and thank you for all of your hard work. So I've got a question. Just how many of you would be working in the lab together on that trial?
So on that trial, I only have 1 student who is working on running that trial. Although other people in the NF clinic are helping. Sally has been from the CTF has been helping at the clinic, trying to introduce people to Emily and looking at people interested in the trial. And certainly people from Josh Burns's lab have been very helpful with a lot of the gate lab measurements and access to the gate lab for that trial. Yeah. But I also have, there's another individual in the lab who has been who's working on the mouse experiments at the moment, because they are still ongoing. We have a grant for those. But I also have a team of like 7 or 8 other researchers who work on other things. So I mean, I do have a passion for working the NF field, but NF does not pay the bills, so to speak. I often take money from other projects and use it for NF where I can, because it is challenging often to grant fund for.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask Aaron? No?
Yes, I've got a question.
Great.
I've got a question. Do you think, you talked about in children, do you think there's a possibility that could help adults as well?
Well, it is possible. So the one of the people in our trial, his father has NF, and his father has started taking it. We have not told them to take it, but I've said he's decided to start taking it. So and I've been contacted by other people outside who are adults, asking either to be in the trial or saying that they have concerns about muscle where they've read stuff and want to know. So we tend to sort of, I have a standard blurb or email that I send back, which is that there is no clinical data for safety or efficacy. We cannot recommend people that they do these interventions. Yeah. But we understand that people do this anyway, and we would encourage people, for our data collection's sake, to still continue to feed back what they're doing, because it is helpful for us to know, both whether it works or any adverse events that can happen, because that all feeds into the picture.
Yeah. No, that's good to know. Thank you. Good question, Alison. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they want to ask Aaron while we've got him? No? Kristina, are you...
Oh, Holly was going to...
Oh, sorry, Holly. Sorry.
I was just wondering, how do we find out what kind of dietary supplements you're talking about?
So, well, the answer is that because we don't want everyone rushing off and taking the supplements, I have a talk version that I use for science audiences, and I have this version. But because I don't want to be seen to be advertising for something which is not a officially approved intervention. At the same time, if you if you Google my name and muscle, you can pretty much find what we've done, because
Okay.
Thank you.
It's on the internet. We've published everything.
Thank you.
Thank you, Holly.
Thanks.
All right. Anyone else? Last chance while we've got Aaron.
I'd like to ask a question, please.
Great.
I was wondering, so there was a slide about the different tests you used to measure muscle strength and the improvement in fatigue and other outcomes, and I was wondering, does the improvement look different over time, and how soon can you reliably measure it?
So are you asking for mice or for people?
Well, I'd be interested in either answer. Sorry, I'm just asking out of scientific curiosity.
Yeah. So the answer is we tend to pick I'll do mice first. So for mice, we've tended to pick a fairly standard 2-month protocol. But the question of how early we start seeing effects, that's one that we're currently trialing, and that's what one of my students has been doing for most of this year, is breeding mice and doing a longitudinal time course. So that means so different time points at different times to try to find out when we first start seeing the effects. And the other part of that study is to take the mice off of the intervention and see if the lipid comes back and how long that takes to come back. So that's one of the advantages of mice, is that you can do these sorts of studies and you can't go and take a bunch of biopsies from children like every 2 weeks. You just can't do that. But the mice don't get a choice, unfortunately. They just get samples taken. So the part of the clinical trial has been based on a couple of things. One is the interventions that are currently used for those other conditions, like primary carnitine deficiency, and that sort of guided doses. Also, we've been partially guided by a number of individuals who fed back to us, some of them reporting very positive effects with their children being on the intervention, and what doses they used, and what sort of times they saw things happening. So I think that there's a little bit of arbitrariness, I guess, in picking time points. because we wanted to pick, times that were, if it took 12 months to have any sort of effect, no one in the real world would stay on an intervention for 12 months without seeing any real practical effect. So we wanted to look at a time by which people would see an effect. If an effect was there, it would encourage people to stay on it. So that's part of the reason, and also based partly on the mice that the lipid did disappear within 8 weeks quite rapidly, and we did see strength improvements in that time as well. So that sort of answer your question?
Yes, thank you. It answered it excellently.
Okay.
No, that was amazing.
Kristina, I made you presenter again.
No.
Thanks, Aaron.
And I love that the trial started just over a conversation with somebody. That's amazing, and thank you. Do we go to you, Kristina? Are you ready to give your presentation?
Let's try again.
Fingers crossed.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
You can see your whole screen if you make the presentation. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. No, disappeared.
Yep.
And now we're back. Perfect. We can see.
Okay.
And we can see you, so all good.
Me and the presentation.
Oh, we can see it all, and we can hear you too. Even more fabulous. All good.
The whole kit and caboodle. Okay, sorry about before.
No, that's good. And thank you, Aaron, for going ahead. Really appreciate it.
Okay, so firstly, I wanted to speak a bit more broadly about what a researcher does. And as I was saying before, I dropped out before, the first part of the research project is to really think about what's been done. What's been done so far? What does the literature or the research other groups and people around the world so far tell us? What did they look at? What did they show? What's the background that we're working from, or what's been done? And from what's been done, it's the researcher sort of then goes to find out what's not being done. So, thinking about while reading the previous research, what sort of questions come out of that, and what sort of questions remain despite the current research. So the researcher will sort of read widely and broadly and use that to sort of inform the question that they have, the question that remains, and the question that they would like to ask in order to sort of address a gap, address something that's missing. And so they might, for example, be interested in figuring out, what sort of current options there are and how they could be improved. They might do that by testing a new sort of medication, a new sort of device, or a new sort of intervention. So from a neuropsych perspective, it might be, a new intervention trying to help improve someone's thinking skills, or in psychology, it might be about using some sort of anxiety, some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy to treat anxiety, or something like that. So the next step is to find ways to address the research gap, or to find ways to answer the question that the researchers have. So to do that, they sort of think about what ways they could go about that. What is the best approach to answering the question, and figure out what's the best way forward to try and address the gap. So it might be, from the example before about the neuropsychology, thinking about improving thinking skills. It might be thinking, okay, well, what's the best thinking skills intervention program that we have, and oh, what happened to my slides?
Oh, we're back. We're good. Just going backwards.
What sort of programs out there already have tried to improve, for example, someone's concentration or their ability to use their working memory, so calculate things in their head, and could we use that? Is that a good measure for us to use, or is there something better? And sort of choosing how they're going to answer the question that they've identified from reading the previous literature. Once the researchers have a good idea about what's being done, what the question is, and how they sort of think they might be able to answer it and what they might like to do to answer it, they generally need to seek some funding to pay for what they're hoping to do. And so seeking funding involves writing up a proposal, which basically summarizes the points I've just said. So what's being done, what's not being done, how they'd like to go about answering that question that they have. And they write it up in a proposal and then submit it to a funding group. It might be a government funding group, like Aaron mentioned, the Department of Defense in America. It could be a charity. It could be, you know, certain like benefactors, or, you know, presenting to benefactors to highlight what they're hoping to do and how they're hoping to do it. And the process of seeking funding for research is quite competitive. Yeah. Many people will write these proposals and enter them in like a competition, really, and the funding body will then sort of determine what they most want to fund based on how important they think it is, and they probably will think about that and as to what sort of impact, which of these proposals has a really good impact in, say, the NF community, which of these is really meaningful to the people who this is hoping to help. Yeah, so that's sort of the process of going ahead and trying to get money. So we as researchers are competing against one another in healthy competition to try and get this money and get this funding in order to, you know, answer the big questions that we have. If you're competitive enough and fortunate enough to be rewarded with a research grant and get the funding that you hope for as a researcher, then you're offered the grant, and it's conditional on you carrying out what you've said you would do in the proposal, typically, and you sort of start the next process. So once you're funded, you write up a study protocol, which really explicitly outlines sort of the recipe, in quotation marks, telling exactly who can and can't take part, so who's eligible, who's ineligible, how you'll get these eligible people recruited into your study, what tests or assessments will be done to answer the question, and you have to make sure you're only including things that are specifically answering your question. It needs to be specific and have a purpose, and you know, you need to say how long the study is going to go for, and you need to set out a plan, a timeline and plan, and adhere to that. What sort of information you'll be collecting, how you intend to use that information to answer the original question. So answer the question using statistical analysis to figure out what's really meaningful and what the answers are. And then you also need to outline what you're going to do after, and how you're going to share those findings. And the proposal, so the protocol is very important in that it should resemble a recipe in the sense that they want the funding body wants to sort of know enough detail that someone else would sort of be able to replicate it, to do the same thing. So it needs that really specific amount of detail so that it's really clear to anyone who read it exactly how it was carried out, what are the steps in the recipe to bake the cake, to answer the question really. After the study protocol's been finalised, what we do is we approach official ethics governance bodies in order to say this is the protocol that we're hoping to outlay, and you know, do we have permission? Is the study lawful? Is it it won't cause any harm, and it won't put anyone or in the institute in a position where they're doing something improper, or no one's going to be at risk, or there's no one in a position of negligence. So they'll check it over for all those things, and they might ask the researchers to make edits or changes to improve the study, and the researchers are obliged to make those changes to the protocol and the study before taking any further steps. So Aaron and I were sort of talking a little bit before, that can be a reasonably short process, or it can be a very long process taking up to 6 to 12 months, and some of the more involved intervention studies are the ones that can take a little bit longer to nut out all those finer details, as the ethics bodies are really fastidious about all the finer details. So that's a really big process. So after all of that's passed through and you've got the tick of approval from the ethics body, that's when the researchers can get started and roll out the recipe and roll it out in that time frame, and go through the whole process. So there's lots of different types of research studies that might be conducted as part of the research process. There's a number of different studies, but I'm just going to talk about two main types that our group in particular are running quite a few of, and that are quite interesting, important types of research studies. Mm-hmm. The first example is a observational research study. So this is a type of study that is observing a behaviour sort of in its current state or its ongoing state, and measuring it and characterising it, understanding what it looks like, how it behaves, how it changes. And you can do that at one time point, which is called a cross-sectional research study, so a snapshot in one point of time. Or you can do other kinds of observational studies, which are called, one in particular is called a longitudinal research study. So you might get a particular group of people involved and see them, for example, in children, you might see them all age 5, and then you might follow up and stay in your protocol that you're going to ask them all back at age 7 to see how they've changed between 5 years of age and 7 years of age. And you know, a lot of those longitudinal studies are really interested in getting people back at as many sort of follow-up, it depends on the question that they're trying to answer, but in childhood we're often talking about development and change over time, so we're often trying to see people at every couple of years doing follow-up to try and look at how things are tracking over time and how they change or develop. It's called trajectories. So that's observational studies. Another really important type of study is a clinical trial. So a clinical trial is essentially looking at testing an intervention, and that could be a number of types of things. They test whether a type of a drug or another type of intervention has a benefit for the patient, and they're also really important in that they sort of inform clinicians and researchers to weigh up any benefit with the risk of harm, such as side effects. So is taking this particular medication is the benefit of it greater than the potential side effects it might have, such as, you know, loss of appetite or sleeplessness at night. So it's really sort of trying to figure out whether something's a really meaningful and important or helpful sort of intervention to help a subgroup of people. So yeah, it could be a device like a hearing device to assist with auditory difficulties maybe. It could be an activity like, does exercise help to reduce depression or anxiety in this particular group? Or it could be a medication like, you know, can taking a stimulant medication help to improve or rescue attention difficulties in kids with ADHD. So in these kinds of studies, participants can receive one or more treatments. So for example, they might, with a medication study, they might receive the medication, and then they might receive a second sort of medication that's actually like a sugar pill or a placebo, so that they can compare how people are on the medication versus how they are when they're not taking that medication, and sort of looking at how people perform on tests, or how parents think their children behave when they're on the medication versus when they're taking the sugar pill. And often in those kinds of studies, the parents are sort of, people are what we call blinded. So it's nobody knows when they're taking the stimulant medication versus the sugar pill or the placebo. And that's so we sort of reduce any bias that might come into the study based on expectation and things like that. Another example of how that might work in a sort of a device-based study would be someone might get a hearing device that's switched on for a period of time, and then it might be switched off for the second period of time. So it's sort of having a sort of a pure time when they're not taking it versus a time, or not using it versus a time where they are, and being able to then compare how people, you know, how people think or behave when they're on or off the sort of active version and the inactive version. In Australia, clinical trials are overseen by national government codes of conduct to ensure that everything's done to a high and lawful standard, and medications and devices have to follow international guidelines as well, so the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and it's all to ensure safety and make sure that people aren't at risk of being harmed by the intervention, and making sure if it is like a medication with some side effects, that the study has put in place the appropriate checking procedures in their protocol to monitor and ensure people's safety, and you know, act on anything if it for some reason was producing more harmful side effects than expected. So to have procedures in place to be able to take care of people if they were having a bad experience or something like that. In Australia, clinical trials sort of traditionally have various phases. So in the first instance, a pilot or phase 0 or a pilot study is done, and that's a initial sort of test to see how a medication or a device or an activity goes when it's tested in a really small number of people, so 5 to 10 or so, and that's just an example, not a direct figure, but it's to see how small people go in a very short period of time. And also the other main purpose of a pilot study is to see if it's practical. So if it's a device, will the kids wear it? If it's a medication, actually I can't speak to medication pilots too thoroughly, but it's all about feasibility. Like, is it practical to do this study? Is it worth pouring money, time and resources into laying this out in a bigger group of people? Or are there really big sort of hurdles we need to think about reconfiguring when we write the protocol for the main study? You know, what worked, what didn't? So thinking really around those kinds of issues in the pilot study. If a pilot study is quite effective, then it's used to sort of often gain, pilot studies are often used when researchers go and seek funding. So they'll often sort of say, hey, look, we did this test in this small group of people, and it showed some really promising results. We would really like to see what this would look like in a larger group of people, how this would play out in a larger sample, and yeah, it's often a really good starting point for researchers to gain the funding they need to ask some bigger questions. So then phases 1 through 4 are really about sort of moving from the initial sort of phase right up to possibly rolling out a new medication or study and then looking at it over time. So in phase 1, it might be a smallish group of people, 20 to 80 or so, looking at safety of giving it the medication, device, activity, intervention, and you know, how much of the dose to give, how often to give the intervention, what are the side effects and difficulties associated with them, and what does that look like when you sort of test it, and how does it affect the group or the outcome you're sort of looking at? Like, does it improve concentration? Does it help with hearing difficulties? Does it help reduce anxiety, depression? In phase 2, up to a few hundred people might be enrolled in a clinical trial to see if it works as it is intended to in a larger group, and again, to check side effects and difficulties associated with those interventions. In phase 3, it moves to a very large group, sort of several hundred to thousands of people, and often in those phase 3 studies, they're looking at how the intervention you've tested compares to other ones that are currently available, and again, looking at any undesirable side effects or practical difficulties in an even larger subset, in order to be able to make really sort of confident statements about how it's tolerated, or how it can be used in large groups of a particular particular groups. And phase 4 studies are sort of after an intervention has been marketed or carried out, and they're looking at really the ongoing impact and benefits or side effects, monitoring really how it looks over time, its effectiveness over time, that intervention. They might also at this point be looking at how it interacts in combination with other therapies or other medications, so sort of teaming it up with something else to see if they can I guess join forces in helping to improve people's life and sort of daily function. So that's a bit of a brief overview of clinical trials. I just want to talk about taking part in a research study now. So when you take part in a research study, the first step is sort of being approached or approaching a research project in order to take part. When you approach, the first step is finding out the information about the study. So I've put up some shots here of information consent forms. So we will hand these out to families to give them a full overview of what the study involves, who funds it, what are the potential risks, if any, of taking part. So it might be side effects. It might be, you know, perhaps some distress in filling out a questionnaire about your feelings and your mood. Other things that the consent form will run through might be just flagging potential inconveniences of taking part, like you know, taking your time, the time spent taking your child to complete an assessment, or time spent doing questionnaires, things like that. Of course, the inconveniences will depend on the various studies, but I'm just sort of thinking about a few that come up in the neuropsych assessments that we do with children. The neuropsych aspect, I guess, in some of our studies. It will also outlay the benefits that there might be to taking part. So, for example, it might be, you know, learning a little bit more about your child. You might also get extra sort of things like cognitive reports for your child that summarize how they went across various measures, which, you know, in the community to seek out and get privately could cost hundreds of dollars. There might be other benefits depending on the study, like gift vouchers or incentives. Yeah, it really depends on the various studies. So really the information statement is to outlay as much information as it can to make the person understand fully what they're getting themselves into if they sign up. It's important during the information giving process for the potential participant to ask questions, and yeah, really sort of query the researcher on what is involved, or any questions that they have about giving their time or their child participating, or, you know, confidentiality and things like that. That anything that they don't feel has been satisfied by the information form. And that's another thing that's always covered by the information form is confidentiality and limits to confidentiality. You know, if someone disclosed that they might want to, might be feeling like they might want to, if they might be feeling quite low in their mood, or things like that, limits to, I've gone a bit off track there actually.
Like if they were at risk themselves, that you would need to report that. I think that's what you're trying to say. You know, if somebody was expressing that they were going to harm themselves or someone else, then you would need to break that confidentiality. I think that's...
Yes. Yes, thank you. And also just things like the data, you know, all your personal details are kept confidential, and everything's sort of de-identified, so sort of no one can pinpoint who you are, things like that. If the participant, people feel comfortable after reading all of that, and they can give consent to take part in the study, and go ahead and start and take part. And one important thing about research is that people should know that they're always able to pull out at any time. It's signing consent is not a firm, unbreakable contract. It's saying that yes, I'm happy to take part now, but as always with any research study, people can pull out at any time if they decide for whatever reason they'd prefer not to continue on. Yeah. So after people take part in the research, and the researchers have gathered all their various bits and pieces of data, it's important to try and figure out what the data is, what it all means, and what do we find, and what's the answer to the question. What does this information have to offer us in answering the question that we set out to evaluate? So in order to do that, statistics comes into the mix. And so statistics is just basically a big technique to crunch all the numbers and find patterns in numbers and figure out what's sort of so unique in this finding that's different to what we would expect that occurs to chance. What's like a really unique finding that means something special, and how, what does that does that answer our question, and did we find out that the question and what we were thinking would be the case was indeed the case or not? And you can have results that mean something, can mean what you thought they would meant, and that's an interesting finding and important to share. But sometimes you might find that what you expected as a researcher didn't actually come to fruition, didn't actually happen, and that's also an important finding in and of itself, because it might be like, well, this medication didn't actually work to improve attention difficulties in these children. So it might then be a really important finding to say, well, this isn't the best treatment for that difficulty, and sort of spurs on research to look at what else might be beneficial. So yeah, findings that come out of statistics and the results that they give, they're important, whether they're positive findings or negative findings. It's still really informative and helps to guide what's done next in the research, and sort of takes you back to that initial step in the first place, which is looking at the previous research and what's been done. Even this a finding that is not expected is an important finding, because it sort of helps to steer what's funded next, what questions answered next. After all the results and after all the statistics are conducted, the results are gathered, and the sort of the findings are understood and thought about, it's important to share those findings, because what's the point in doing all this hard work if you don't share it with the world and the community, and especially like an intervention, like if it's meaningful and effective, that's a really important thing to know clinically, and to make the the clinicians that are perhaps rolling it out, the psychologists or the neuropsychologists or the pediatricians, whoever, and then also to let the community know what's best and what's not best, and why, and who it might be effective and helpful for. So there's a few key ways of doing that, and I've put up some little photos of some journal articles, some manuscripts here, and they're sort of like what they are. They're small professional articles that summarize the whole process I've just sort of spoken about in a really succinct sort of 2, 3, 4, 5,000. Well, it sounds quite long, but it's very succinct. Goes through the background, the methods, the stats, the findings, what it means, and really conveys as a nice short story what was done and what was found. And they're published in medical journals or psychological journals or scientific journals on the internet, and I think they make hard copies too, which is a bit old-fashioned these days. And in those are then accessible by all the other researchers, and some open to the public as well. And I think it just really depends on the journal. And with publishing in manuscripts in journals, not all journals are equal, so some are more prestigious than others, and whether a journal we apply to publish in these journals, and whether they accept it or not is a particular process as well. So when a researcher submits to a journal, it's reviewed under a process called peer review, which essentially means that it's sent around to other experts in the relevant field, and they're asked to have a look over it and sort of look at it with a critical eye, and ask questions that they feel are important, and determine the quality of the written manuscript, and that can be that's quite a process for researchers. You can have, you know, multiple reviews going through refining a manuscript before it goes to publication. Yeah, and some of the higher level journals, they you know, they might only accept the cream of the crop sort of manuscripts that are submitted, or they're ranked as well. So they're sort of reviewing your work, and the more prestigious journals, it's harder to submit your work and get it published by those ones. But those ones, all the manuscripts that those higher level journals publish, you know they're of a very high quality, because the standard is held to be very, very high. I'm just mindful that I'm chatting and going on, and that we're approaching the end. The only other outlet I was going to mention is that conferences. So I just put up some of the big conferences from last year and this year that the Children's Tumour Foundation run, which is, you know, a time for NF researchers around the world to meet up and share their findings, and share what they've done, and ask questions, and yeah, go through sort of interesting points from their findings, and network and form alliances and things like that. I'll just quickly glide over the next couple. So the research that we're doing at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute is looking at outcomes, so cognitive, behavioural, emotional outcomes in children with NF1, and we also look at other measures of things like neurobiology using MRI scanning. We're also looking at biological mechanisms using things like stem cell technology, and we collaborate with sites internationally and nationally. I've just put up a few there, and we're running a couple of key observational studies at the moment. The PANDA study is looking at social cognition and so autism symptoms in children with NF1, and along with the peer study, and we've got some clinical trials running at the moment. The methylphenidate study is looking at stimulant-based medication in children with NF1, and if that can help to improve attention and concentration difficulties. The CogTrain study is a clinical trial that's looking at using a cognitive intervention program to treat working memory difficulties. The psychometric study is looking at what computerized measures that we use in testing thinking skills of children with NF1, and how are they reliable to use over time points and use as measures for clinical trials. And I've got a typo there, but pilot study is meant to say audiology pilot study, which is looking at auditory processing difficulties in children with NF1. The couple of up and coming research days that we've got an observational study starting next year that's looking at fatigue and sleep in children with NF1. And in the next sort of 6 to 12 months, we're a site on the TINCH trial, which is looking at trametinib, a MEK inhibitor medication that helps to reduce tumours in children with NF1, particularly optic pathway and plexiform neurofibroma tumours. And I don't really have time to deliberate on that too much, but yeah, it's essentially looking at tumour reduction, using an inexpensive and very difficult to get medication, and it will be
it will involve kids from 3 months to 25 years of age over 2 years. And that's a study that's up and coming, that funding's still being raised to carry out on, but we're very confident that it will be up and running very soon. It's a very important study. Anyway, I'm going to stop blabbering there.
It's been wonderful.
Well, just on that study, Kristina, we are so close to reaching the $100,000 that we need for that study. So we're hoping to finalise that in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's really exciting, and we've been very lucky that the drug company that makes the trametinib has offered to provide all the medication free of charge. And I mean, this is a really substantial thing too, because this typically costs about $1,000 a month, this medication. So that's, you know, thousands and thousands a year that they're supplying free of charge. So it's really about getting all the money to fund all the other aspects to the study, which is a lot of other things too.
Yeah. Amazing, and thank you. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Kristina?
I think I saw one pop up on the chat.
Yeah, that was me, Alison. My question has to do with access to journals, because the journal publishers put very restrictive contracts on the unis. And I, as a member of the public, can't go into a uni, look at a database, and even if I join the uni, I can't join the uni library and get access to the databases and access to the journals. It's very frustrating.
I'm not entirely sure about that. Is Aaron there? Does he know?
Yeah, I've had conversations with the Vice Chancellor of Deakin about it. It's all the publishers of the journals put very restrictive contracts on the universities that only staff and students are allowed to access a lot of the good, decent journals and the good database.
So that is correct. That's true. So there are ways that you can get around that, in so much as you can write to people who have published papers and ask for prints of it, because they often have the ability to share prints or copies. And you can similarly contact the authors through ResearchGate. I don't know if people have seen ResearchGate. It's a website where often researchers will have a profile and they post papers, and sometimes the website, people will post the copies of the papers there. A lot of papers become available to share in that way after 12 months. So a lot of the papers will have limited licenses. So you can't necessarily get access to them as a non-academic immediately, but you can get access to them after 12 months, either through the publisher or through one of those sites. Or you just have to look for journals that are open access, because so that's what open access means, that everyone is able to look at the journal. There is a push to increasingly encourage papers to be published open access, but no one wants to pay for it. In Australia, there is no requirement to publish open access generally. We have to put if it's HMRC funded, it has to go into a university database, but again, that's behind a non-public firewall. However, in the United States, all NIH funded research is required by law to be published open access. So anything that has been funded by basically the American government, you have to be able to access it no matter where you are in the world. It's open access. That doesn't exist in Australia, though. Is that helpful? I don't know, maybe.
Well, it confirms what I know. It does get very frustrating.
Yes, look, I understand. Unfortunately, no one wants to pay for all the research to be, publicly open access. Some of my papers, if a very prestigious journal, or it's research that I do want people to be able to access, I will pay the open access fees, but that will often come out of donated funds or sort of limited departmental funds, which, because a single paper open access is about $2,000 to $3,000 to be make publicly available. So I published 12 papers so far this year. If I was going to make all of them open access, that's like $25,000 or something or more. I can't afford that.
Yeah.
Yep, I understand.
The idea of contacting the researchers was a good one, Aaron. Thank you. Maybe you could try that, Alison.
Yeah.
Yep.
I thought that was a good tip. Thank you.
Often have listed up the top corresponding author.
Yeah.
And that person generally lists their email and is the person who's really happy to be contacted and ask those sorts of questions. And yeah, I would hesitate
to research. That's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
some authors are really, really good.
Yeah.
That's good to hear.
Anybody else got any last questions before we wrap up?
Will the slides be available anywhere?
We hope so. We've
Okay,
recorded the whole webinar, so what we do with it now, we'll be in touch and we will let you know.
Yeah, sorry,
Thank you very much.
This is our first one, so there should be a transcript available.
That's our plan.
And we're hoping that the slides are part of that process of this recording this webinar. If they're not, then we will contact Kristina and Aaron directly to get a copy and make that available on our website. But it does take a couple of weeks, I believe, to get the transcript sorted. So leave it with us. We will certainly try and make that happen.
Excellent. Thank you.
No, thank you for joining us. That was great. And thank you so much to Kristina and Aaron for giving up your time, and for everybody who joined us. That was really wonderful. I think you might all have Meredith and I's emails. So if you want to email us, follow up in the next week or so and just say what you thought was good, we're more than happy to have feedback, good or bad. So please do follow up with us, and we'll be in touch. That was great.
Thank you.
Anything else, Kristina and Aaron, before you sign off?
Oh, if anyone's interested in, I know I very vaguely skipped over the research days that we're running, but we are recruiting for the studies that I mentioned that we're currently running.
Great.
And we will be recruiting for our future studies in early 2020. So you might be able to look at that a little bit more closely from the slides that Meredith shares. But yeah, I'm happy to be contacted about any interest in any studies. And we do run some of them in Sydney as well, so please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Great.
Yeah.
I think that's it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time. Thanks very much for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.